Hey everyone, welcome back to the Atlas Archives Deep Dive series, where we journey through the landscapes, histories, and hidden stories of every nation on Earth. Tonight, our exploration takes us to Brunei, a tiny, forest-cloaked kingdom tucked away on the northern coast of Borneo. Though small in size, Brunei's wealth, culture, and history run deep, shaped by centuries of trade, faith, and royal legacy. In this episode, we'll take a calm, unhurried walk through Brunei's geography and past from the golden domes of Bandar Seri Begawan to the stilted homes of Kampong Ayer, from the untouched rainforests of Ulu Temburong to the legacy of the powerful Bruneian Empire that once ruled the seas of Southeast Asia. It's a story of prosperity, spirituality, and balance between tradition and the modern world. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see this community tuning in from all around the world. And if you're enjoying these quiet, immersive journeys, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. Now, take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's gently drift into the story of Brunei, the abode of peace. Chapter 1. The Jewel of Borneo. Our story begins with geography, that fundamental foundation upon which all human tales are built. Brunei Darussalam, to give it its full and rather musical name meaning abode of peace, occupies a truly unique position in Southeast Asia. Picture, if you will, the massive island of Borneo, the third largest island in our world, surpassed only by Greenland and New Guinea. Upon this vast green canvas, Brunei claims a modest but strategically positioned territory of 5,765 square kilometers, roughly equivalent to the size of Trinidad and Tobago, or if you prefer a more homely comparison, about twice the size of Luxembourg, with significantly more tropical humidity. What makes Brunei's geography particularly fascinating, and perhaps slightly amusing from a cartographer's perspective, is that the country exists in two completely separate pieces, rather like a jigsaw puzzle that someone has deliberately separated. The larger western portion contains three districts: Brunei Muara, Tutong, and Belait, while the smaller eastern enclave consists entirely of Temburong district. Between these two sections lies a wedge of Malaysian territory belonging to the state of Sarawak, specifically the Limbang division, which has the rather cheeky effect of splitting Brunei in two like a polite but firm border guard who insists on checking everyone's passport twice. This geographical peculiarity occurred not through some ancient geological upheaval, but through the more mundane machinations of colonial-era boundary negotiations, where lines were drawn on maps by officials who had never set foot in the steaming jungles they were dividing. The result is that if you wish to travel from Brunei's capital to Temburong district by land, you must cross Malaysian territory. A journey that requires either a good relationship with your neighbours or a very patient approach to border formalities. The position of Brunei on the northwestern coast of Borneo places it at approximately 4 degrees and 30 minutes north latitude and 114 degrees and 40 minutes east longitude. This location, while perhaps not immediately memorable to most people, sits in one of the world's most strategically important maritime regions. The South China Sea, which laps against Brunei's 161 kilometers of coastline, serves as one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, connecting the Indian and Pacific Oceans like a massive, perpetually active highway for international commerce. Brunei's territorial waters extend 200 nautical miles into the South China Sea, encompassing an exclusive economic zone that contains not just fish and coral reefs, but also the offshore oil and gas deposits that have transformed this small sultanate into one of the world's wealthiest nations per capita. It's rather remarkable to consider that beneath these tropical waters lie the hydrocarbon treasures that have allowed Brunei to provide free healthcare, education, and even subsidized housing to its citizens, making it something of a real-life fairy tale kingdom, albeit one powered by petroleum rather than magic. The terrain of Brunei presents a delightful variety of landscapes within its compact borders. The northern coastal areas consist primarily of flat plains that gradually give way to gently rolling hills, and, in the eastern Temburong region, dramatically rise to mountainous terrain. The country's highest point, Bukit Pagon, reaches 1,850 meters above sea level. Not quite alpine in stature, but certainly impressive enough to catch clouds and create the diverse microclimates that make Brunei such a biologically rich environment. These elevation changes create a natural amphitheatre of ecosystems, from the mangrove swamps that fringe the coast to the lowland dipterocarp forests that dominate the interior, and finally to the montane forests that crown the higher elevations. It's as if nature designed Brunei as a compact showcase of Southeast Asian biodiversity, cramming an extraordinary variety of habitats into a space smaller than most metropolitan areas. The climate of Brunei can be described as persistently tropical, with the sort of reliable warmth and humidity that makes air conditioning not just a luxury, but a fundamental requirement for comfortable existence. Throughout the year, temperatures hover between 24 and 32 degrees Celsius, with humidity levels that would make a rainforest feel at home, which is convenient since much of Brunei actually is rainforest. The daily rhythm of temperature variation is minimal, creating what meteorologists politely term an equatorial climate, and what residents might more accurately describe as perpetually warm and sticky. Rainfall in Brunei follows the monsoon patterns that govern much of Southeast Asia, though with its own local variations. The northeast monsoon typically arrives between December and March, bringing with it the heaviest precipitation of the year. During these months, the coastal areas receive approximately 2,900 millimeters of rainfall annually, while the interior mountainous regions can experience over 3,800 millimeters, enough water to fill a very large swimming pool if you happen to have one sitting in your backyard for an entire year. The southwest monsoon period, spanning from May to September, brings somewhat drier conditions, though dry, in Brunei, is a relative term that would still seem quite wet to visitors from more arid climates. The transitional months of April, October, and November provide brief respites between these monsoon seasons, though the humidity remains constant enough that one rarely forgets they are in the heart of tropical Southeast Asia. This generous and reliable precipitation supports one of Brunei's most remarkable features, its pristine tropical rainforests. Approximately 72% of the country remains forested, making Brunei one of the most heavily forested nations in the world. These forests are not merely trees standing together in green solidarity. They represent some of the most biodiverse ecosystems on our planet, home to an almost overwhelming variety of life forms that would take several lifetimes to catalogue properly. The forests of Brunei are dominated by mixed dipterocarp trees, those magnificent giants of the Southeast Asian rainforest that can reach heights of 60 meters or more. These ancient trees, with their characteristic buttressed roots spreading like the fingers of enormous hands, create cathedral-like canopies that filter the tropical sunlight into a soft green glow. Walking through these forests, one might imagine entering nature's own cathedral, where the pillars are living wood and the ceiling is an intricate tapestry of leaves and sky. Within these forest communities live some of the world's most charismatic and endangered species. The Bornean orangutan, with its remarkable intelligence and endearing habit of building elaborate sleeping platforms in the trees each night, finds sanctuary in Brunei's protected forests. The proboscis monkey, with its distinctive large nose that would be considered unfortunate in human society, but serves important social and acoustic functions in monkey culture, represents one of Borneo's most distinctive endemic species. Perhaps even more remarkable than these larger mammals is the extraordinary diversity of smaller life forms that populate Brunei's forests. The country hosts over 500 species of birds, more than 2,000 species of insects, and nearly 4,000 species of arthropods. To put this in perspective, you could spend several years simply cataloguing the different types of beetles in a single hectare of Brunei forest and still not finish the job. A fact that would be either thrilling or terrifying depending on your feelings about scientific research and very small creatures with lots of legs. The plant diversity is equally staggering, with over 3,000 species documented within Brunei's borders. These range from the massive dipterocarp trees that dominate the canopy to delicate orchids that bloom in ethereal beauty high in the forest's upper reaches, visible only to the most dedicated botanical enthusiasts willing to climb considerable heights in pursuit of natural beauty. The forests also harbour numerous plants with practical applications, medicinal herbs that have been used by indigenous communities for centuries, timber species prized for construction and crafts, and fruit trees that provide sustenance for both human and animal communities. Brunei's commitment to forest conservation is remarkable in a region where deforestation has become a pressing environmental concern. The government has established extensive protected areas, including the Ulu Temburong National Park, which has been recognized as an ASEAN Heritage Park for its exceptional biodiversity and pristine condition. This park, located in the mountainous Temburong district, serves as a living laboratory for researchers studying tropical ecology and a testament to what Southeast Asian forests looked like before human development transformed much of the region. The waterways of Brunei provide another fascinating aspect of the country's geography. 4 major river systems drain the nation's territory: the Belait, Tutong, Brunei, and Temburong rivers. These rivers serve not just as drainage for the frequent tropical rains, but as highways through the forest, corridors for wildlife movement, and sources of fresh water for both human communities and natural ecosystems. The Belait River, the largest of these systems, drains an area of 2,700 square kilometres and flows through the heart of Brunei's oil and gas-producing region. Along its banks lie the towns of Seria and Kuala Belait, where the discoveries that transformed Brunei from a modest trading sultanate into a modern wealthy nation first emerged from the earth in the early 20th century. The river's mouth, like those of its sister waterways, is characterized by complex estuary systems where fresh water meets the sea, creating rich ecosystems that support both marine and terrestrial life. These estuarine environments are dominated by mangrove forests, those remarkable ecosystems that thrive in the brackish waters where rivers meet the sea. Mangroves might seem like rather humble trees to the casual observer, but they represent one of nature's most efficient environmental engineers, stabilizing coastlines, filtering water, providing nurseries for marine life, and storing vast amounts of carbon in their root systems. In Brunei, these mangrove communities line much of the coast, creating a living barrier between land and sea that protects inland areas from storm surges while supporting an intricate web of marine and avian life. The coastal waters of Brunei are remarkably rich in marine biodiversity, supporting approximately 1,138 species of fish, 200 species of mollusks, and 100 species of crustaceans. These waters serve as feeding and breeding grounds for sea turtles, including the green sea turtle and olive ridley turtle, which return to Brunei's beaches to lay their eggs in one of nature's most ancient and moving rituals. The sight of a sea turtle laboriously making its way up a moonlit beach to dig a nest for its eggs connects us to biological processes that have continued unchanged for millions of years. Dolphins and whales regularly visit Brunei's coastal waters, taking advantage of the rich feeding opportunities provided by the convergence of river nutrients and marine ecosystems. The waters also support extensive seagrass beds, underwater meadows that provide crucial habitat for marine life and help stabilize the seafloor, though they lack the charismatic appeal of more visible ecosystems and rarely receive the attention they deserve for their ecological importance. Beneath Brunei's lands and coastal waters lie the hydrocarbon deposits that have fundamentally shaped the modern nation's development and international profile. Oil was first discovered in Brunei in 1899 when the first well was drilled near the capital, though it would be several decades before the true extent and commercial viability of these resources became apparent. The Seria oilfield, discovered in the 1920s, became Brunei's first major commercial petroleum operation and remains an important production centre to this day. These oil and gas reserves, formed over millions of years from the accumulated organic matter of ancient marine ecosystems, have allowed Brunei to achieve one of the highest per capita incomes in the world while maintaining a small population and extensive forest cover. The country's approach to managing these resources has been notably conservative, with production levels carefully managed to ensure long-term sustainability rather than maximum short-term extraction, a policy that has allowed the reserves to continue providing national wealth for nearly a century. The discovery and development of these hydrocarbon resources fundamentally altered not just Brunei's economy, but its entire social and political structure. The wealth generated from oil and gas exports allowed the government to provide extensive social services to its citizens, including free healthcare, education, and subsidized housing. It also reduced pressure for large-scale agricultural development or intensive logging, inadvertently helping preserve the very forest ecosystems that make Brunei such a remarkable biological treasure. The geographical isolation created by Brunei's small size and division into two separate territories might seem like a disadvantage, but it has actually contributed to the preservation of the country's natural environment. The eastern Temburong region, in particular, remains largely pristine due to its physical separation from the more developed western districts. This isolation has created what amounts to a natural nature preserve, where primary rainforest continues to thrive, largely undisturbed by human development. Climate change poses significant challenges to Brunei's low-lying coastal areas, where rising sea levels threaten infrastructure and coastal ecosystems. The country's extensive river systems and coastal plains make certain regions particularly vulnerable to flooding, a concern that has become increasingly pressing as weather patterns become more unpredictable. Recent years have seen increased frequency of flash floods, particularly in the Belait and Tutong districts, highlighting the need for adaptive management strategies in this tropical environment. The government has responded to these challenges by investing in climate resilience measures and participating in international environmental agreements, including the Paris Climate Accord and various ASEAN environmental initiatives. Brunei's participation in the Heart of Borneo Conservation Initiative, a collaborative effort with Malaysia and Indonesia to preserve a central area of Borneo's rainforests, represents an important commitment to regional environmental stewardship. Perhaps most remarkably, Brunei's geographical features have allowed it to achieve something rare in the modern world: significant economic prosperity combined with exceptional environmental preservation. While many developing nations have faced difficult choices between economic growth and environmental protection, Brunei's oil wealth has provided the luxury of preserving its natural heritage while still achieving high living standards for its citizens. As we conclude our exploration of Brunei's remarkable geography, we might reflect on how this small nation demonstrates that size is not necessarily correlated with significance. Within its modest borders, Brunei contains some of the world's most pristine rainforests, remarkable biodiversity, significant natural resource deposits, and a unique blend of terrestrial and marine ecosystems. Its position at the crossroads of major sea lanes and its role as a biological refuge make it far more important to regional and global systems than its small size might suggest. The geographical foundation we have explored tonight sets the stage for the human stories that follow: tales of ancient kingdoms, colonial encounters, independent struggles, and modern prosperity. But perhaps the most important lesson from Brunei's geography is that in our interconnected world, even small places can harbour great treasures, both natural and cultural, that deserve our attention and respect. Chapter 2. Before the Sultans, Early History and Indigenous Peoples. To understand Brunei before the Sultans, we must begin with the most ancient inhabitants of Borneo, a story that stretches back into the deep past when our world looked quite different than it does today. Archaeological evidence suggests that modern humans first reached Borneo approximately 40,000 years ago, during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower and what we now call Southeast Asia formed a vast landmass known to scientists as Sunderland. These earliest settlers, whom researchers call Austro-Melanesians, left traces of their presence in the famous Naya Cave in nearby Sarawak, a limestone cavern that has yielded some of Southeast Asia's most important prehistoric discoveries. The remains found there, dating to around 40,000 years before our current era, represent some of the earliest evidence of human habitation in this part of the world. These ancient people were skilled hunter-gatherers who adapted remarkably well to the tropical forest environment, developing techniques for living in harmony with one of the world's most challenging and complex ecosystems. Around 10,000 years ago, as the world warmed and sea levels rose, new waves of migration reshaped Borneo's population. These Austronesian peoples brought revolutionary technologies: agriculture, pottery making, and advanced boat-building techniques that would make them some of history's greatest ocean navigators. They were sophisticated seafarers who chose to make their homes along the rivers and coasts of northern Borneo. By around 3,000 years ago, these early inhabitants had established settled communities throughout the region that would become Brunei. They practiced a mixed economy combining shifting agriculture with fishing, hunting, and gathering. These communities were far from isolated. Archaeological evidence shows they participated in extensive trade networks that connected them to other parts of Southeast Asia and even to distant China and India. The evidence for this early trade comes from a fascinating archaeological phenomenon known as the Maritime Jade Road, a trading network that operated for approximately 3,000 years, from 2,000 years before the Common Era until around 1,000 years after it. This network, centered on Taiwan and the Philippines, carried precious stones, particularly jade and obsidian, across vast distances throughout Southeast Asia. Areas that would later become Brunei participated actively in this ancient commerce, suggesting that the entrepreneurial spirit that would later characterize the Brunei Sultanate had very ancient roots indeed. The peoples who lived in these early communities developed sophisticated understanding of their environment and its resources. They discovered that the rivers flowing from Borneo's interior carried gold, a resource that would remain important throughout the region's history. They learned to collect and process camphor, an aromatic resin from certain forest trees that was highly prized throughout Asia for its medicinal properties and its use in religious ceremonies. Brunei camphor, in particular, became so renowned for its quality that it was said to be worth its weight in silver in Chinese markets. These early inhabitants also collected birds' nests from the limestone caves along the coast. The edible nests of swiftlets that were considered a great delicacy in Chinese cuisine and were believed to possess remarkable medicinal properties. The collection of these nests required considerable skill and courage, as it involved scaling dangerous cliff faces and navigating treacherous cave systems but the rewards were substantial enough that the practice became a cornerstone of the local economy. The social organization of these pre-Islamic communities was complex and varied. Many groups practiced animistic religions that saw spiritual forces in natural phenomena, in the great rivers that provided transportation and sustenance, in the ancient trees that dominated the forest canopy, and in the changing patterns of monsoon rains that governed agricultural cycles. These belief systems emphasized harmony between human communities and the natural world, a philosophy that would influence the region's approach to environmental management for millennia to come. Leadership in these early societies often combined practical skills with spiritual authority. Chiefs needed to demonstrate competence in organizing trade expeditions, mediating disputes, and coordinating agricultural activities, but they also served as intermediaries between human communities and the spirit world. This combination of temporal and spiritual authority would later find expression in the institution of the Sultanate, where rulers combined political power with religious leadership. By the 6th century of the Common Era, Chinese historical records begin to provide more detailed information about the kingdoms and settlements in northern Borneo. Chinese sources from this period refer to a kingdom called Poli, or Puni, which most scholars believe corresponds to an early form of Brunei. These records describe a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom that governed 136 regions and maintained regular diplomatic contact with China. The fact that Chinese sources describe this early kingdom as Hindu-Buddhist is particularly intriguing, as it suggests that Indian cultural and religious influences had reached northern Borneo by this time. This should not be entirely surprising, as Indian traders and missionaries had been active throughout Southeast Asia for several centuries, bringing with them not only religious concepts but also political ideas about kingship, administrative practices, and artistic traditions. The influence of Indian civilization can be seen in various aspects of early Brunei culture. The very name Brunei may derive from the Sanskrit word Varuna, referring to the Hindu god of the sea, an appropriate patron deity for a maritime trading kingdom. Early rulers adopted Sanskrit titles and incorporated Hindu and Buddhist symbols into their regalia and architectural projects. This cultural synthesis created a distinctive form of Indianized Southeast Asian civilization that combined local traditions with imported concepts. The Chinese records from this period describe remarkable diplomatic activities. In 518, the King of Brunei sent envoys to China, bearing gifts including gold mats and other local products. 5 years later, another delegation arrived with additional presents including seashells, perfumes, and various local goods. Around 669, Brunei again dispatched envoys to China, this time alongside representatives from Siam, suggesting that diplomatic protocol had become quite sophisticated by this time. These diplomatic missions were not mere courtesy calls. They represented serious commercial and political relationships. China's imperial court operated a tributary system in which neighboring kingdoms acknowledged Chinese supremacy in exchange for protection and favorable trading privileges. For smaller kingdoms like Brunei, participation in this system provided access to Chinese markets and protection from larger regional powers, while China benefited from the regular flow of tribute and exotic goods. By the 7th century, the settlement that would become Brunei had developed into what Chinese sources called Vijayapura, a name that reflects the continuing influence of Indian culture, as Vijaya means victory in Sanskrit. This settlement was described as a vassal state of the Buddhist Srivijaya Empire, the great maritime trading kingdom centered in Sumatra that controlled much of the Malacca Strait and the surrounding waters during this period. The connection to Srivijaya is particularly significant because it demonstrates that early Brunei was integrated into the sophisticated trade networks that connected the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. Srivijaya merchants and administrators brought with them not only goods but also ideas about urban planning, governmental organization, and religious practice. The Buddhist influences that entered Brunei during this period would coexist with earlier animistic beliefs and later Islamic teachings, creating the syncretic religious culture that characterizes the region to this day. The indigenous peoples of this era developed remarkable skills in boat building and navigation. Using Austronesian techniques, local craftsmen built vessels capable of carrying substantial cargoes across treacherous waters. Navigators understood monsoon winds, reef locations, and seasonal currents, developing techniques for reading wave patterns, clouds, and bird behavior. This knowledge represented one of the world's great maritime traditions. Archaeological excavations in the Brunei area have revealed evidence of substantial settlements during this pre-Islamic period. The site known as Kota Batu, near present-day Bandar Seri Begawan, shows evidence of continuous occupation from at least the 10th century onward. Excavations there have uncovered Chinese ceramics, Indian beads, Middle Eastern glass, and local pottery, demonstrating the cosmopolitan character of these early trading centers. One of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries related to this period is a 15th century shipwreck found off Brunei's coast in 1997. This vessel, which sank some 32 nautical miles from shore, contained over 13,000 artifacts, mostly ceramics from China, Thailand, and Vietnam. The sheer volume and diversity of goods aboard this single vessel provides dramatic evidence of the scale and complexity of the maritime trade networks in which early Brunei participated. The ceramics found in the shipwreck tell a fascinating story of long-distance commerce. Many pieces were manufactured in Jingdezhen, the famous porcelain-producing centre in China, then transported by river to coastal ports like Quanzhou in Fujian province before being loaded onto ships bound for Southeast Asia. The presence of Thai and Vietnamese ceramics alongside Chinese pieces suggests that merchants were stopping at multiple ports, building diverse cargoes that could appeal to different markets throughout the region. Perhaps even more intriguing than the shipwreck itself is what it suggests about the people who were conducting this trade. The vessel appears to have been heavily overloaded, which may have contributed to its sinking, but this also suggests that merchants were willing to take considerable risks in pursuit of profit. The diversity of the cargo indicates sophisticated understanding of different market preferences, while the high quality of many pieces suggests that Brunei was considered an important enough market to justify shipping luxury goods across considerable distances. The indigenous peoples of pre-Islamic Brunei lived in communities that were both diverse and integrated into trading networks. The 7 main groups, Brunei, Tutong, Belait, Dusun, Murut, Kedayan, and Bisaya peoples, each developed distinctive practices while maintaining extensive contact with one another and outside traders. The Dusun were skilled agriculturalists who developed sustainable shifting cultivation techniques. The Murut specialized in forest knowledge, understanding hundreds of plant species for food, medicine, and crafts. The Kedayan became rice cultivation experts with sophisticated irrigation systems. The Bisaya excelled as fishermen and boat builders. All groups shared knowledge freely, intermarried across ethnic boundaries, and developed sustainable approaches to resource management. The religious practices of these pre-Islamic peoples emphasized interconnectedness with the natural world through animistic beliefs, recognizing spiritual forces in rivers, ancient trees, and seasonal cycles. These traditions included elaborate ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and healing rituals. Shamans served as spiritual leaders and intermediaries with the spirit world. Hindu and Buddhist influences, arriving from the 5th century onward, created synthetic religious traditions combining local and imported elements. Hindu concepts influenced political organization, while Buddhist ideas provided ethical frameworks, But traditional animistic practices continued alongside these teachings, creating the religiously diverse culture that characterizes the region to this day. By the 10th century, Chinese sources begin to provide more detailed information about what they call the Kingdom of Boni, which most scholars identify with early Brunei. A Chinese text from 977 describes a diplomatic mission sent by King Hyangta of Boni to the Chinese court, bearing tribute and seeking to establish formal diplomatic relations. This mission represents the earliest clearly documented evidence of Brunei as a distinct political entity with sufficient organization to conduct international diplomacy. The Chinese sources describe Boni as a wealthy kingdom that controlled extensive territories and commanded considerable respect from neighboring powers. They note that the kingdom possessed substantial naval forces and maintained regular trade relationships throughout Southeast Asia and beyond. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts, with Chinese ceramics and coins from this period found throughout the Brunei area, indicating substantial commercial relationships. Perhaps most remarkably, these same Chinese sources mention the presence of a Chinese Muslim named Pu Lu Xie, who arrived in Brunei in 977. This represents some of the earliest evidence for the presence of Islam in the region, suggesting that Islamic influences began arriving in Brunei much earlier than previously thought. While the royal family would not convert to Islam for several more centuries, the presence of Muslim merchants and diplomats indicates that Islamic ideas and practices were gradually becoming familiar to local populations. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the political landscape of Southeast Asia was dominated by the great Hindu Javanese kingdom of Majapahit, and Brunei found itself drawn into this powerful empire's sphere of influence. The Javanese text, known as the Nagara Kretagama, written in 1365, mentions Brunei as one of the territories that owed tribute to Majapahit. This tribute consisted of 40 katis of camphor annually, a substantial amount that demonstrates both Brunei's wealth and the continuing importance of forest products in the regional economy. The relationship with Majapahit was probably more complex than simple tributary status. Majapahit was primarily a land-based power that depended on coastal kingdoms like Brunei to provide access to maritime trade networks. In exchange for acknowledging Majapahit's suzerainty and paying tribute, Brunei likely received protection from other regional powers and preferential access to Javanese markets. This arrangement allowed local rulers to maintain substantial autonomy while benefiting from connection to a larger political and economic system. During this period, we begin to see the emergence of the political and social structures that would later characterize the Brunei Sultanate. Local leaders adopted Hindu Javanese titles and administrative practices while maintaining many traditional approaches to governance. The combination of indigenous leadership traditions with imported concepts of divine kingship created distinctive forms of political authority that would prove remarkably durable. As we reach the end of the 14th century, we approach the threshold of dramatic change. The conversion of the Brunei ruling family to Islam would transform not just religious practices but political, social, and cultural life throughout the region. The foundations laid by generations of indigenous peoples, their maritime skills, their commercial networks, their sustainable approaches to resource management, and their traditions of inclusive governance would provide the platform upon which the Islamic Sultanate would build its remarkable success. But that is a story for our next evening together. Tonight, as we prepare for sleep, we might reflect on the remarkable achievements of these pre-Islamic peoples who turned a challenging tropical environment into a thriving center of trade and cultural exchange. Their legacy lives on not just in the genetic heritage of modern Brunei's population, but in the cultural practices, environmental knowledge, and maritime traditions that continue to shape life in this remarkable corner of Southeast Asia. Chapter 3: The Rise of the Sultanate. Our story begins in the late 1400s with a man who would change everything. Awang Alak Betatar, a name that may sound unfamiliar to modern ears, but represents one of the most consequential figures in Southeast Asian history. He was, according to traditional accounts, one of 14 siblings born to a somewhat mythical father named Dewa Imas Kayangan and a Murut woman from Limbang. A origin story that blends the human and divine in the way that many royal genealogies tend to do when they reach back into the mists of time. What makes Awang Alak Betatar's story particularly intriguing is that despite not being the eldest of his siblings, he rose to become the ruler of what was then still a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom. The reasons for his selection remain something of a mystery, though traditional sources suggest he possessed qualities of leadership and charisma that made him particularly suitable for kingship. Perhaps, more importantly for our story, he also possessed the kind of adaptability and openness to new ideas that would serve him well in the momentous decision he was about to make. The transformation began, according to most accounts, sometime around 1368, when this Hindu-Buddhist king made a decision that would echo through the centuries. He chose to convert to Islam. The immediate catalyst for this conversion was intensely personal. His desire to marry a princess from the royal house of Johor, a union that required him to embrace the Islamic faith. This princess, variously described in different sources as the daughter of Sultan Iskandar Shah, or connected to the legendary Sang Nila Utama, represented not just a romantic attachment, but a political alliance with one of the region's most important Islamic kingdoms. Upon his conversion, Awang Alak Betatar took the name Sultan Muhammad Shah, and with this simple change of name, he created something entirely new in the world: the Brunei Sultanate. This was not merely a change of religious allegiance, but the birth of a new form of governance that would combine Malay cultural traditions, Islamic principles of law and administration, and the practical needs of ruling a maritime trading empire. It was, one might say, the world's first successful experiment in what we now call the Malay Islamic Monarchy. The establishment of the Sultanate was far more than a personal religious conversion. It represented the careful construction of a new political and social order. Sultan Muhammad Shah and his advisors had to navigate the delicate process of introducing Islamic practices and principles while maintaining the loyalty and cooperation of subjects who had lived for generations under Hindu-Buddhist traditions. This required a remarkable degree of cultural sensitivity and political skill, creating synthetic institutions that honoured both Islamic requirements and local customs. One of the most significant changes was the establishment of Islamic law alongside traditional customary law. This wasn't a simple replacement of old with new, but rather the creation of a dual legal system that allowed different communities to live according to their own traditions while participating in the larger Islamic political framework. Non-Muslim communities could continue their traditional practices in personal and family matters, while Islamic law governed the broader political and commercial activities of the Sultanate. The conversion also transformed Brunei's international relationships, connecting it to the broader Islamic world and the networks of trade and scholarship that linked Muslim societies from Spain to Southeast Asia. Islamic merchants, scholars, and craftsmen began arriving in increasing numbers, bringing with them not only goods and knowledge, but also the cultural connections that would make Brunei a more cosmopolitan and internationally connected society. Sultan Muhammad Shah's reign, which lasted until 1402, laid the foundations for what would become one of the most successful Islamic kingdoms in Southeast Asia. Under his leadership, Brunei began the systematic expansion that would eventually create a maritime empire stretching from Borneo to the Philippines. This expansion was driven not by conquest alone, but by the attractive combination of profitable trade opportunities, Islamic solidarity with Muslim communities throughout the region, and the practical advantages of being part of a larger political and economic network. The early sultans who followed Muhammad Shah continued this pattern of careful expansion and cultural synthesis. They understood that their strength lay not in imposing uniformity, but in creating a system flexible enough to accommodate the remarkable diversity of peoples and cultures throughout their expanding domains. This approach would prove crucial to their success, as it allowed them to integrate new territories without provoking the kind of resistance that might have destroyed a more rigid system. The reign of Sultan Bolkiah, who ruled from 1485 to 1524, marked the absolute pinnacle of Brunei's power and influence. Under his leadership, the Sultanate achieved what can only be described as imperial status, with territories extending throughout Borneo into the southern Philippines and including strategic positions along the coast of what is now Malaysia. This was Brunei's golden age, when the Sultanate commanded respect from powers as distant as China and the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Bolkiah, also known by the rather romantic title of Nakhoda Ragam, was everything a medieval king was supposed to be. A skilled military leader, an astute diplomat, and a patron of arts and learning. His conquests were legendary, with traditional accounts describing him sailing around Borneo planting pepper seeds on every island he conquered, a charming detail that speaks to both his thoroughness as a conqueror and his practical interest in developing the economic potential of his new territories. The Sultan's military campaigns were remarkably sophisticated for their time, combining naval power with diplomatic skill and an understanding of local conditions that allowed him to succeed where others might have failed. Rather than simply imposing Bruneian rule by force, he often worked with existing local leaders, incorporating them into his administrative system and allowing them to maintain their traditional authority while acknowledging Brunei's overall sovereignty. Perhaps most significantly, Sultan Bolkiah's expansion brought Brunei into direct contact with the emerging European colonial powers, particularly the Spanish, who had established themselves in the Philippines. The Sultanate's control over Manila and other strategic locations in Luzon put it on a collision course with Spanish ambitions in the region, setting up the conflicts that would eventually limit Brunei's expansion and force it to adopt a more defensive posture. The wealth generated by this vast empire was extraordinary, even by the standards of an age that was generally quite wealthy. Brunei controlled the flow of spices, gold, camphor, and other valuable commodities through some of the world's most important trade routes. The revenues from tribute, customs duties, and direct trade allowed the sultans to maintain courts of remarkable magnificence, with golden regalia, elaborate ceremonies, and architectural projects that impressed visitors from across Asia and Europe. This wealth was not merely accumulated for its own sake, it was reinvested in the infrastructure and institutions that made the empire possible. The sultans built and maintained a navy capable of projecting power across vast distances, established administrative systems that could govern diverse populations across multiple islands, and created the educational and religious institutions necessary to train the scholars and officials who would keep this complex system functioning. The cultural achievements of the Golden Age were equally impressive. Brunei became a centre of Islamic learning, attracting scholars from throughout the Muslim world who came to study and teach in the Sultanate's mosques and schools. The architectural legacy of this period included magnificent structures like the Great Mosque that Spanish visitors described as a 5-story building constructed on the water, a testament to both the engineering skills of Bruneian craftsmen and the wealth that made such ambitious projects possible. However, the very success of the Sultanate also contained the seeds of future challenges. The expansion that had brought such wealth and power also created administrative burdens that would prove difficult to maintain over time. governing territories scattered across hundreds of islands required sophisticated logistics and communication systems that were vulnerable to disruption by new military technologies and changing patterns of international trade. The first serious challenge to Brunei's regional dominance came with the Spanish decision to establish permanent settlements in the Philippines and to challenge Islamic influence in the region directly. This led to the Castilian War of 1578, a conflict that, while brief, would prove to be a turning point in the Sultanate's history. The war began when Spanish governor Francisco de Sande demanded that Sultan Saiful Rizal allow Christian missionaries to operate in Brunei, while simultaneously ending Islamic missionary activities in the Spanish-controlled Philippines. The Spanish expedition against Brunei was formidable, consisting of 400 Spanish and Mexican soldiers, 1,500 Filipino auxiliaries, and 300 Borneans who had allied themselves with the Spanish cause. This force was aided by two Bruneian nobles, Pangeran Seri Lela and Pangeran Seri Ratna, who had their own reasons for opposing the ruling sultan and saw an alliance with Spain as a path to power. The Spanish attack on April 16th, 1578, initially succeeded in capturing Kota Batu, Brunei's capital, forcing Sultan Saiful Rizal to flee to the interior. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Sultanate might fall to European conquest, just as so many other Southeast Asian kingdoms had done. However, the Spanish victory proved to be both brief and Pyrrhic. Within weeks, disease, likely cholera or dysentery, had devastated the Spanish forces, killing hundreds of soldiers and leaving the remainder too weak to maintain their occupation. After just 72 days, the Spanish were forced to abandon Brunei and return to Manila, but not before burning the Great Mosque and destroying much of the capital. The immediate military result was a Bruneian victory, but the longer-term consequences were more complex. While Brunei had successfully defended its independence, the conflict demonstrated the vulnerability of even the most powerful indigenous states to European military technology and organization. More significantly, the war marked the beginning of Brunei's transformation from an expanding empire to a more defensive city-state. The costs of defending against European attacks, combined with the disruption of traditional trade patterns, forced the sultans to abandon their policies of territorial expansion and focus instead on consolidating control over their core territories. This was a rational response to changing circumstances, but it also marked the end of Brunei's role as a regional imperial power. The period following the Castilian War saw Brunei entering what historians call its period of decline, though this term perhaps overstates the extent of the Sultanate's difficulties. While Brunei was no longer the dominant regional power it had been during the Golden Age, it remained a wealthy and culturally sophisticated kingdom with significant influence over maritime trade routes and important connections to the broader Islamic world. The challenges faced by later sultans were real and significant. Internal disputes over succession created political instability that weakened the central government and encouraged provincial rebellion. The rise of European colonial powers, not just Spain but also the Dutch and British, disrupted traditional trading patterns and created new forms of competition that Brunei's medieval institutions were not well equipped to handle. The increasing prevalence of piracy in the region, partly as a result of displaced populations and economic disruption, made maritime trade more dangerous and expensive. Perhaps most significantly, the changing nature of international trade began to work against Brunei's traditional advantages. The Sultanate's power had been built on its ability to control strategic maritime choke points and to serve as an intermediary between different regional trading networks. However, European merchants increasingly preferred to deal directly with the sources of valuable commodities, bypassing traditional intermediaries and reducing the revenues that had funded the Sultanate's power. Despite these challenges, Brunei's leaders proved remarkably adept at adapting to changing circumstances. Rather than attempting to maintain their empire through increasingly costly military campaigns, the sultans chose to focus on diplomacy and trade, developing relationships with European powers that allowed them to maintain their independence while benefiting from new economic opportunities. This period also saw important developments in Brunei's internal governance and culture. The synthesis of Islamic and Malay traditions that had begun with Sultan Muhammad Shah's conversion continued to evolve, creating distinctive forms of law, administration, and cultural expression that combined Islamic principles with local customs in ways that remained uniquely Bruneian. The continuing vitality of this cultural synthesis would prove crucial to the Sultanate's ability to maintain its identity through the challenges that lay ahead. The scholarly and artistic achievements of this period were also significant. While Brunei may no longer have commanded the vast resources of the Golden Age, it remained a center of Islamic learning and Malay culture. The development of a distinctly Bruneian form of Islamic scholarship, the elaboration of court traditions that combined Islamic and pre-Islamic elements, and the continuation of architectural and artistic traditions all contributed to the creation of a cultural identity that would prove remarkably durable. As we approach the end of the Sultanate period with the establishment of the British Protectorate in 1888, we can see how the Islamic Sultanate that began with Awang Alak-Betatar's conversion had evolved into something quite different from what its founder might have imagined. What began as an ambitious maritime empire had become a more modest but still significant kingdom that had successfully navigated the challenges of European colonialism while maintaining its independence and cultural identity. The legacy of this Sultanate period would prove enduring. The institutions and traditions established during these centuries would survive British protection, Japanese occupation, and the transition to modern independence, providing the foundation for contemporary Brunei's unique system of government and its distinctive cultural identity. Perhaps most remarkably, the spirit of adaptation and cultural synthesis that characterized the Sultanate from its beginning continues to shape Brunei to this day. Just as Sultan Muhammad Shah successfully combined Islamic principles with Malay traditions and practical governance needs, modern Brunei has found ways to honor its traditional heritage while embracing the opportunities and challenges of the contemporary world. Tonight, as we settle into sleep, we might reflect on the remarkable journey from Awang Alak-Betatar's conversion to the establishment of the British Protectorate, a journey that transformed a small Hindu-Buddhist kingdom into an Islamic sultanate of regional significance, and then successfully adapted that sultanate to survive in an age of European colonial expansion. It is a story of remarkable resilience, cultural creativity, and political skill that deserves to be remembered and celebrated. Chapter 4: Under the British Umbrella. When we left our story at the end of the 1800s, Brunei was in what one might diplomatically call a rather precarious position. The once mighty maritime empire that had controlled vast stretches of Borneo and the Philippines had been reduced to 4 small river valleys, surrounded by the rapidly expanding territories of James Brooke's Kingdom of Sarawak and the British North Borneo Company. It was rather like watching a magnificent old mansion being sold off room by room until only the kitchen and a couple of bedrooms remained. Sultan Hashim Jalilul Alam Akamaddin, who ruled from 1885 to 1906, found himself in the unenviable position of presiding over what many observers believed to be a dying kingdom. The territorial losses had been devastating. Limbang district, which connected Brunei's 2 remaining territories, had been seized by the Raja of Sarawak in 1890, effectively cutting the Sultanate in half like a rather unsympathetic pair of scissors. The Sultan was left with what amounted to the head and feet of his kingdom, with Charles Brooke controlling the vital middle. It was in this desperate context that Sultan Hashim made what would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in Brunei's history. He appealed to the British Empire for protection. The Treaty of Protection, signed on September 17, 1888, with British representative Sir Hugh Low, was essentially an admission that Brunei could no longer survive as an independent power in a region increasingly dominated by European colonial interests. The treaty itself was deceptively simple, just 8 articles and a preamble that would fundamentally alter the nature of Brunei's sovereignty. On paper, the agreement seemed relatively benign. Brunei would continue to be governed by the Sultan and his successors as an independent state under British protection. Britain would handle Brunei's foreign affairs, and British subjects would receive commercial privileges equal to those enjoyed by Bruneian nationals. What could possibly go wrong with such a reasonable arrangement? Well, quite a lot, as it turned out. The treaty's most significant weakness became apparent almost immediately. While it theoretically prevented further territorial losses without British consent, it provided no mechanism for enforcing this protection. When Charles Brooke simply annexed Limbang in 1890, just 2 years after the treaty was signed, Sultan Hashim discovered to his horror that British protection was rather like an umbrella made of paper, theoretically useful, but not particularly effective when the storm actually arrived. The Sultan's growing disillusionment with British protection reached its peak in 1902, when he wrote a remarkably frank letter to King Edward VII, expressing his frustration. "From the day I set my hand to the Treaty of Protection," he lamented, "I have not once received assistance or protection from your Majesty's government." It was the kind of complaint that any modern consumer might make about a warranty that turned out to be worthless, though considerably more diplomatically phrased. The British response to Sultan Hashim's complaints came in the form of Malcolm Stuart Hannibal MacArthur, a British official who arrived in 1904 to investigate the situation in Brunei and write what would become known as the Report on Brunei. MacArthur was an interesting character, part administrator, part anthropologist, and part travel writer, with the kind of comprehensive approach to colonial administration that characterized the best of British imperial service. MacArthur's report, completed after 3 months of intensive investigation, painted a devastating picture of Brunei's condition. He described a kingdom that had no government in the usual sense of the term, only ownership, where the traditional distinction between public and private resources had completely broken down. The Sultanate's finances were in chaos, its administration was practically non-existent, and its remaining territories were plagued by internal disputes and external pressure. However, rather than recommending the obvious solution, partitioning Brunei between Sarawak and North Borneo, as many of his colleagues expected, MacArthur made a surprising recommendation. He argued that Brunei should be preserved as an independent sultanate, but only if fundamental reforms were implemented under British supervision. His report became the foundation for what would be known as the Supplementary Agreement of 1905 to 1906, which established the British residency system in Brunei. The residency system represented a sophisticated form of indirect colonial rule that the British had perfected in other parts of their empire. Rather than governing Brunei directly, Britain would appoint a resident, effectively a colonial administrator, whose advice the Sultan would be bound to accept in all matters except those relating to Islamic religion and Malay custom. It was a clever arrangement that allowed the British to control Brunei's administration while maintaining the fiction that the Sultan remained the country's legitimate ruler. Malcolm MacArthur himself became Brunei's first British resident in 1906, and he immediately set about implementing the kind of comprehensive administrative reforms that he had recommended in his report. His first challenge was establishing a functioning revenue system. Since Brunei's traditional tax farming arrangements had broken down completely, since the Sultanate had no money to buy back these tax farms, MacArthur arranged loans from other Malayan sultanates, loans that would eventually be repaid from an unexpected source. The early years of the residency focused on essential administrative reforms. MacArthur and his successors established proper accounting systems, created a police force, improved public health measures, and began rebuilding Brunei's economy. Since the Sultanate had no money to buy back tax farms, MacArthur arranged loans from other Malayan sultanates, Marsum dollars plus, loans that would eventually be repaid from an unexpected source. The relationship between the British residents and the sultans was complex and sometimes tense. While the residents showed public deference to the sultan and scrupulously observed court ceremonies, everyone understood that real power lay with the British official. From the perspective of ordinary Bruneians, the resident had what appeared to be absolute authority, since appeals over his decisions could only be made outside the country. It was a situation that required considerable tact and diplomacy from both sides. For nearly 2 decades, this system functioned reasonably well, if not spectacularly. Brunei's administration was gradually modernized, its finances stabilized, and its territories protected from further encroachment. However, the Sultanate remained economically marginal, dependent on modest revenues from traditional exports like kutch, a tanning extract produced from mangrove bark, and struggling to generate the kind of income necessary for significant development. Everything changed on April 5, 1929, when oil began flowing from well S1 near the town of Seria. This event, which might have seemed like a minor industrial development, transformed Brunei's prospects more dramatically than any political treaty or administrative reform could have done. Within a few years, the small sultanate had become the British Empire's 3rd largest oil producer after Trinidad and Burma, and was generating revenues that dwarfed anything in its previous history. The discovery of oil at Seria was the result of more than 2 decades of patient exploration by various companies working under British licenses. The first prospecting licenses had been issued in 1906, shortly after the establishment of the residency system, but early exploration efforts were hampered by difficult terrain, tropical diseases, and the technical challenges of drilling in a jungle environment. Several companies had tried and failed before the British Malayan Petroleum Company, a subsidiary of Royal Dutch Shell, finally struck liquid gold. The transformation that followed was remarkable. Within a decade, Brunei had gone from being one of Britain's poorest protectorates to one of its most valuable possessions. The Sultanate's oil was particularly prized because it was the high-quality light crude that was ideal for aviation fuel, a product that would prove crucial during the Second World War. By the mid-1930s, Seria was producing over 17,000 barrels per day, and the revenues flowing into Brunei's treasury allowed for the kind of development that had previously been unimaginable. The oil discovery also fundamentally altered the political dynamics of the residency system. A wealthy Brunei was far more valuable to the British Empire than a poor one, and the colonial office became much more committed to protecting the Sultanate's territorial integrity. The 1906 supplementary agreement had already prevented further territorial losses, but oil revenues made this protection genuinely meaningful rather than merely theoretical. For the Sultans, oil wealth provided both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, the revenues allowed them to modernize their kingdom, improve social services, and enhance their own prestige both domestically and internationally. On the other hand, the strategic importance of oil meant that British oversight became more intensive rather than less so. The colonial office was not about to allow anything to threaten the security of such a valuable asset. The Second World War brought both triumph and tragedy to Brunei. The Sultanate's strategic importance was dramatically illustrated when Japanese forces invaded in December 1941, just a few days after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese recognized the crucial importance of Brunei's oil production and moved quickly to secure the Seria field, which they operated throughout the war to supply their military machine. The Japanese occupation lasted from 1941 to 1945 and was a period of considerable hardship for the Bruneian population. Traditional sources are somewhat circumspect about this period, but it's clear that the Japanese administration was far more harsh and extractive than British rule had been. Food shortages, forced labour, and cultural suppression created widespread suffering, while the Sultanate's Chinese population faced particularly severe persecution. The liberation of Brunei in June 1945 by Australian forces marked the beginning of a new phase in the Sultanate's development. The post-war period saw rapid reconstruction of the oil industry and the beginning of what would become an extraordinary economic boom. More importantly for our story, the war had demonstrated both the strategic importance of Brunei's resources and the vulnerability of small states in an increasingly dangerous world. The post-war period saw rapid reconstruction and extraordinary economic boom. Oil revenues funded massive investments in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, transforming Brunei into a modern welfare state with living standards among the highest in Southeast Asia by the 1950s. Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin III, who came to power in 1950, proved particularly effective at maximizing Brunei's autonomy while maintaining British protection. Often called the architect of modern Brunei, he understood that oil wealth gave him unprecedented bargaining power with the colonial office. The 1950s brought decolonization pressure and proposals for a Malaysian federation, including Brunei. However, Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin III rejected federation membership, concerned about diluting Brunei's oil wealth among a larger population and subordinating Islamic institutions to secular federal authority. The Brunei Revolt of 1962, quickly suppressed with British help, validated his concerns about political tensions. Instead of joining Malaysia, Brunei chose a different path: gradual evolution toward independence, while maintaining its special relationship with Britain. The Constitution of 1959 had already ended the formal residency system and restored considerable autonomy to the Sultan, while preserving British responsibility for defence and foreign affairs. This arrangement provided a model for further development that would eventually lead to full independence. The 1960s and 70s were a period of remarkable prosperity and stability for Brunei. Oil production continued to expand, with significant offshore discoveries supplementing the original Seria field. The discovery of major natural gas reserves added another dimension to Brunei's energy wealth and provided the foundation for what would become one of the world's most successful liquefied natural gas industries. During this period, Brunei developed many of the characteristics that would define it as an independent nation. A comprehensive welfare state providing free education and healthcare to all citizens, a deliberate policy of environmental conservation that preserved much of the country's rainforest, and a distinctive blend of traditional Malay culture with Islamic values and modern technology. Sultan Sultan Bolkiah, who acceded to the throne in 1967, inherited a kingdom that was both prosperous and stable, but still formally dependent on Britain for key aspects of sovereignty. His challenge was to manage the transition to full independence while preserving the institutions and traditions that had enabled Brunei to maintain its distinctive character through nearly a century of colonial protection. The negotiations leading to Brunei's independence were remarkably smooth compared to the often traumatic decolonization processes experienced elsewhere in the British Empire. Both Britain and Brunei had strong incentives to maintain their close relationship. Britain valued Brunei as a wealthy and stable ally, while Brunei needed British security guarantees to protect its small territory and valuable resources from potentially hostile neighbours. As our period under the British umbrella drew to a close in the early 1980s, Brunei had achieved something quite remarkable. The Sultanate that had seemed on the verge of extinction in 1888 had not only survived, but had transformed itself into one of the world's most prosperous nations. The key to this transformation had been oil, but the foundation had been the patient work of building effective institutions under British protection. The story of Brunei under British protection demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of colonial rule. At its best, the residency system provided the security and administrative capacity that allowed a small, vulnerable state to develop its resources and modernize its institutions. At the same time, colonial rule inevitably constrained Brunei's sovereignty and limited its ability to determine its own destiny. As we prepare for sleep tonight, we might reflect on this remarkable century of adaptation and survival. From the desperate treaty of 1888 to the confident approach to independence in the early 1980s, Brunei's story under British protection shows how small states can navigate the dangerous waters of great power politics through a combination of pragmatic compromise, careful resource management, and skillful diplomacy. Chapter 5. The Oil Blessing. As the first minute of January 1st, 1984, arrived in Brunei, history was about to be written in the most peaceful way imaginable. While revolutions elsewhere had been marked by gunfire and upheaval, Brunei's transition to independence unfolded with the dignity befitting a nation that had waited centuries for this moment. Under a canopy of rain that seemed to bless the occasion, thousands of citizens gathered at Taman Soas, the field that would forever be remembered as the birthplace of modern Brunei's sovereignty. At precisely 12:01 in the morning, Sultan Bolkiah stepped forward to read the Proclamation of Independence. His words carried the weight of 6 centuries of royal tradition. The time has now arrived when Brunei Darussalam will resume full international responsibility as a sovereign and independent nation in the community of nations. It was a moment of profound simplicity and dignity, as if the nation itself had been quietly gathering strength for this exact moment. Following the proclamation, his father, the former Sultan Omar Ali Saifuddin, led the crowd in 3 triumphant chants of Allahu Akbar, their voices rising into the tropical night like a prayer of gratitude. The choice of ceremonies perfectly reflected Brunei's character. There was no military parade, no display of force, no dramatic rhetoric about throwing off colonial chains. Instead, the new nation announced itself with quiet confidence, like a well-prepared student finally ready to take their place in the world. The Sultan's assumption of the title His Majesty, rather than the previous His Royal Highness, was perhaps the only outward sign that anything fundamental had changed, though of course everything had. What made this independence particularly remarkable was how thoroughly prepared Brunei was for the transition. Unlike many newly independent nations that struggled with institution building and economic foundations, Brunei entered sovereignty with mature governmental structures, a thriving economy, and perhaps most importantly, a clear sense of national identity rooted in its Malay Islam Baraja philosophy. It was rather like an apprentice who had spent decades learning their craft and finally received permission to open their own workshop. Technically, everything was new, but practically they had been ready for years. The celebrations continued with characteristic Bruneian thoroughness. While the formal independence had occurred on January 1st, the government wisely chose February 23rd as the official national day, allowing time for proper preparation of a celebration that would set the tone for the new nation's public life. The date was significant in its own right. It marked the end of Britain's responsibility for defence and foreign affairs, making Brunei's sovereignty complete in every sense. When National Day arrived, the Sultan Bolkiah National Stadium became the stage for a spectacle that somehow managed to be both grand and intimate. Over 30,000 spectators, including representatives from around the world, witnessed a celebration that perfectly captured Brunei's unique character. The ceremony opened with students carrying a giant Brunei flag measuring 12 by 24 feet, while exactly 1,984 balloons were released alongside 1,404 pigeons, representing both the year 1984 and the Islamic year 1404. Even in celebration, Brunei displayed its attention to meaningful detail. The parade that followed was a masterpiece of cultural diplomacy. More than 10,000 students created spectacular formations using coloured umbrellas and flip cards, displaying the national flag and slogans in Jawi script for the assembled dignitaries. The march past included delegations from all sectors of society, from government officials in their finest formal wear to indigenous tribes in their traditional costumes, creating a living tableau of Brunei's diversity. It was democracy by inclusion rather than election. Everyone had a place in the new nation's story. Perhaps more importantly than the pomp and pageantry was what happened in the following days and weeks. Brunei immediately set about establishing itself as a responsible member of the international community, with the methodical approach that had characterized its journey to independence. On January 7th, barely a week after independence, Brunei became the 6th member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, demonstrating that regional integration was a priority from day one. The speed of this admission spoke volumes about how well regarded Brunei already was among its neighbours. The momentum continued with Brunei's admission to the United Nations on September 21, 1984. As the organisation's 159th member, for a nation of barely 200,000 people, this rapid acceptance into major international organisations was remarkable. It helped, of course, that Brunei came with no territorial disputes, no destabilizing revolutionary ideology, and no requests for foreign aid. The new nation was that rarest of creatures, a completely self-sufficient state that asked nothing from the international community except recognition and the right to trade. Behind this remarkably smooth transition lay the solid foundation of Brunei's petroleum wealth, which by the 1980s had transformed the Sultanate into one of Southeast Asia's most prosperous societies. The oil blessing, as it came to be known, provided something that most developing nations could only dream of: the financial resources to build a modern state without accumulating debt or compromising sovereignty. Oil production, which had peaked in 1979 at over 240,000 barrels per day, was deliberately scaled back to extend the life of reserves while still providing enormous revenues. The government's approach to this wealth was revolutionary in its generosity. Rather than concentrating riches in the hands of a few, Sultan Bolkiah implemented what was essentially Asia's first comprehensive welfare state. The philosophy was elegantly simple. Since oil was a finite resource that belonged to all Bruneians should benefit from its extraction: free education from primary school through university, comprehensive healthcare, heavily subsidized housing, fuel and food subsidies, and guaranteed government employment for those who sought it. This wasn't just wealth redistribution. It was a social contract written in petroleum. The national development plans that had begun in the 1950s now took on new urgency and ambition. The 6th National Development Plan of the mid-1990s called for expenditure of over 1,700,000,000 Brunei dollars, more than double the previous plan. These weren't just numbers on a budget. They represented a comprehensive transformation of Brunei's infrastructure that would have taken most countries decades to accomplish. Roads that connected even the most remote villages, telecommunications that brought Brunei into the global conversation, and public buildings that reflected both modern efficiency and traditional aesthetics. The crown jewel of this development was the construction of the Istana Nurul Iman, the Sultan's new palace that would also house government ministries. With 1,788 rooms, This wasn't just a palace, it was a symbol of Brunei's confidence in its future. Critics might have called it extravagant, but for Bruneians it represented something profound. Their tiny nation had the resources and vision to build something genuinely world-class. The palace, with its gold-leaf domes and record-setting size, became a source of national pride rather than resentment because its construction employed thousands and its maintenance supported entire communities. What made Brunei's approach to development particularly intelligent was how it balanced modernization with tradition. While embracing the latest technology and international standards, the government was careful to preserve Bruneian cultural identity. The Malay Islam Monarchy philosophy wasn't just a slogan, it was a practical guide for decision-making that ensured progress didn't come at the cost of social cohesion. When international consultants suggested adopting Western models wholesale, Bruneian leaders politely declined, preferring to adapt innovations to fit their own cultural context. The results were visible in every aspect of life. By the early 1990s, Brunei had achieved literacy rates that rivaled developed nations, life expectancy that exceeded many wealthier countries, and infant mortality rates that placed it among the world's best. These weren't just statistics. They represented thousands of individual stories of children who could attend university regardless of their parents' wealth, families who received world-class medical care without bankruptcy, and elderly Bruneians who could retire with dignity and security. Of course, this approach wasn't without its challenges. By the 1990s, economists were beginning to whisper about the resource curse, the tendency of oil-rich nations to become dependent on a single commodity, develop oversized government sectors, and struggle with economic diversification. Brunei seemed to be proving these theories wrong, but thoughtful observers wondered whether the Sultanate's small size and cultural homogeneity made it a special case rather than a model others could follow. The government was acutely aware of these concerns and had been working on diversification since the early days of the oil boom. The agricultural sector, which had declined as petroleum took center stage, was given new attention with programs designed to achieve food security. Fish farming, poultry production, and vegetable cultivation all received government support and investment. The goal wasn't just economic diversification, it was strategic autonomy, ensuring that Brunei could feed itself regardless of global market conditions. Manufacturing received similar attention, though here the challenge was more complex. With a small population and high wages due to oil wealth, Brunei couldn't compete in labor-intensive industries. Instead, the focus was on high-value manufacturing that could take advantage of Brunei's educated workforce and strategic location. Petroleum refining and liquefied natural gas production became the foundation of a downstream energy industry that added value to raw materials while creating skilled employment for Bruneians. The financial sector offered another avenue for diversification. The Brunei Investment Agency, established to manage the nation's growing foreign reserves, became one of the world's most successful sovereign wealth funds. Rather than simply parking oil revenues in foreign banks, the agency pursued a sophisticated investment strategy that generated returns while spreading risk across global markets. By the mid-1990s, these investments were producing income that rivaled petroleum exports. Tourism presented both opportunities and dilemmas. Brunei's pristine rainforests, unique wildlife, and remarkable cultural sites could certainly attract visitors, but the government was wary of the social disruption that mass tourism might bring. The solution was characteristically Bruneian: selective development that emphasized quality over quantity. Rather than building beach resorts for package tourists, Brunei focused on ecotourism and cultural tourism that attracted visitors genuinely interested in learning about the Sultanate's environment and heritage. International relations in the independence era reflected Brunei's confidence and pragmatism. As a founding member of ASEAN's expanded membership, Brunei often found itself playing the role of honest broker in regional disputes. Its neutrality was credible because it had no territorial ambitions, and its wealth meant it couldn't be bought or threatened. During tense moments in ASEAN's history, particularly during the expansion to include Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia, Brunei's quiet diplomacy often helped bridge differences between members with competing interests. The relationship with Malaysia remained complex but manageable. The border disputes that had simmered for decades were gradually resolved through patient negotiation rather than confrontation. Brunei's claim to the Limbang region of Sarawak was maintained in principle but not pressed aggressively, while practical cooperation in areas like trade and security continued to improve. It was diplomatic maturity befitting a nation that understood its limitations but wasn't willing to surrender its legitimate interests. Relations with China evolved particularly thoughtfully during this period. While maintaining its traditional ties with the West and its ASEAN partners, Brunei recognized that China's growing economic power created both opportunities and challenges. The approach was engagement without entanglement, welcoming Chinese investment and trade, while ensuring that Brunei's strategic autonomy remained intact. This balanced approach would prove prescient as China's influence in Southeast Asia continued to grow in subsequent decades. The United States relationship was perhaps the most straightforward, built on shared interests in regional stability and free trade rather than historical ties or cultural affinity. American companies found a welcoming environment in Brunei's energy sector, while Brunei appreciated American security guarantees that helped maintain the regional balance of power. The relationship was professional rather than emotional, which suited both countries' interests perfectly. By the mid-1990s, Brunei had achieved something remarkable: a successful transition from protected state to sovereign nation without any of the growing pains that typically accompanied such changes. There had been no political upheavals, no economic crises, no social discord. The Sultanate's population enjoyed living standards that rivaled much larger and more developed nations, while maintaining cultural traditions and social harmony that many societies had lost in their pursuit of modernization. The success wasn't just material. Brunei had also achieved something intangible, but equally valuable: national confidence. International respect for Brunei's approach to development and diplomacy was widespread, even among those who might disagree with its political system. For a nation that had spent centuries as a protectorate or colony, this psychological independence was perhaps as important as formal sovereignty. Yet thoughtful Bruneians understood that their success had been built on extraordinary circumstances that might not last forever. Oil reserves were finite, global energy markets were becoming more complex, and the international system was evolving in ways that might challenge small states regardless of their wealth. The question for the late 1990s wasn't whether Brunei had been successful, that was obvious to all observers, but whether that success was sustainable in a changing world. The government's response was characteristically methodical. Rather than assuming that past success guaranteed future prosperity, officials began planning for what they called Brunei beyond oil. This wasn't panic or desperation. Brunei's reserves would last well into the 21st century, but rather the kind of long-term thinking that had served the Sultanate well throughout its history. The goal was to use the remaining decades of oil wealth to build alternative sources of prosperity that could sustain future generations. Education received particular attention in this planning. The University of Brunei Darussalam, established in 1985, was expanded and modernized to become a regional center of excellence. Scholarships for study abroad ensured that Brunei's young people could access the best education available anywhere in the world, while return service programs encouraged them to bring their knowledge home. The investment in human capital was seen as insurance against an uncertain future. Whatever challenges Brunei might face, It would face them with an educated and capable population. Technology and innovation also received new emphasis. While Brunei couldn't compete with larger nations in basic research, it could become an early adopter of new technologies and a testing ground for innovations suited to small, wealthy societies. Telecommunications infrastructure was upgraded to global standards. Computer literacy programs were introduced throughout the education system, and government services were modernized to take advantage of digital technologies. Brunei was positioning itself to thrive in what leaders already recognized would be an information-based global economy. As the 1990s drew to a close, Brunei faced the future with justified confidence tempered by realistic awareness of challenges ahead. The oil blessing had provided an extraordinary foundation for national development, but it was ultimately the wisdom and character of Brunei's people and leaders that had transformed petroleum wealth into genuine prosperity. Other oil-rich nations had squandered their resources on military adventures, prestige projects, or simple corruption. Brunei had chosen the harder but more rewarding path of sustainable development. The Sultanate entered the final years of the 20th century as one of the world's most successful examples of resource-based development. Its combination of traditional governance adapted to modern needs, oil wealth managed for long-term benefit rather than short-term consumption, and cultural preservation balanced with selective modernization offered lessons for nations around the world. Not all of those lessons could be easily transferred. Brunei's small size, cultural homogeneity, and unique historical circumstances were difficult to replicate, but the basic principles of prudent management, long-term thinking, and inclusive development were universal. Most importantly, Brunei had achieved something that no amount of wealth could guarantee: social harmony and national unity in an increasingly complex world. As the new millennium approached, bringing with it technological revolutions, global economic integration, and geopolitical shifts that would challenge all nations, Brunei could face these changes from a position of strength built on solid foundations. The oil blessing had been well used, but it was ultimately the character of the Brunei people that would determine their success in whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 6: Vision 2035. As the year 2000 arrived with its characteristic mix of optimism and uncertainty, Brunei found itself in the enviable position of entering the new millennium from a foundation of strength. While other nations worried about Y2K computer crashes or economic turbulence, the Sultanate faced the future with the quiet confidence that had characterized its approach to independence 16 years earlier. Yet beneath this calm exterior, thoughtful observers recognized that the 21st century would present challenges unlike any that Brunei had previously faced. The first test came sooner than expected. The global recession that followed the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s reminded everyone, even in oil-rich Brunei, that no nation was truly immune to international economic storms. While Brunei's petroleum cushion absorbed much of the immediate impact, the Sultanate's leaders recognized that economic diversification could no longer be treated as a long-term aspiration. It was becoming an urgent necessity. This realization led to the most comprehensive planning exercise in Brunei's modern history. In 2007, Sultan Bolkiah announced Wawasan Brunei 2035, a national vision that would guide the Sultanate's development for nearly 3 decades. The timing was significant, with global energy markets becoming increasingly volatile and climate change emerging as a worldwide concern. Brunei was essentially racing against time to transform its economy before external circumstances forced the transition. Wawasan Brunei 2035 was ambitious in scope but characteristically practical in approach. The vision outlined 3 principal goals: an educated and highly skilled population that met international standards, a quality of life ranking among the world's top 10 nations, and a dynamic, sustainable economy with a GDP per capita to match. These weren't just aspirations written for international consumption. They represented a fundamental commitment to preparing Brunei for a post-oil future, while the Sultanate still had the resources to manage the transition gracefully. The strategies supporting this vision revealed how seriously Brunei's leadership took the challenges ahead. Education received unprecedented attention, with plans to transform the Sultanate into a regional knowledge hub. Economic diversification moved beyond rhetoric to concrete action, with targeted investment in downstream petroleum industries, Islamic finance, tourism, and information technology. Perhaps most importantly, the vision acknowledged that success would require not just government planning, but genuine participation from Brunei's citizens in building their nation's future. The global financial crisis of 2008 provided an early test of both Brunei's resilience and the wisdom of its diversification efforts. While neighboring countries struggled with currency devaluations and banking collapses, Brunei's conservative financial management and substantial foreign reserves provided effective insulation. The Sultanate even managed modest economic growth during the worst global recession since the 1930s, demonstrating that prudent resource management could indeed provide stability in turbulent times. Yet the crisis also revealed vulnerabilities that no amount of oil wealth could fully address. International demand for luxury goods declined, affecting Brunei's nascent tourism industry. Foreign investment flows slowed, hampering diversification projects that depended on external capital and expertise. Most concerning, the crisis highlighted how global interconnectedness meant that even the most carefully managed small economy could be affected by events entirely beyond its control. These concerns influenced one of the most controversial decisions of Sultan Bolkiah's reign: the implementation of the Seria penal code beginning in 2014. The decision generated international headlines and diplomatic tensions that were unprecedented in Brunei's modern history, but the domestic context was more complex than foreign observers often appreciated. For many Bruneians, the move represented a natural evolution of the Malay Islam Baraja philosophy that had guided the nation since independence. The Sultan presented the Sharia code as a protective measure against the negative influences of globalization and the Internet, describing it as a special guidance from God that would help preserve Brunei's cultural and religious identity in an increasingly connected world. Critics abroad focused on the harsh punishments prescribed for certain offences, but the practical implementation proved more nuanced than international media coverage suggested. High standards of proof meant that the most severe penalties remained theoretical rather than applied, while the broader population seemed to view the laws as confirmation of Brunei's commitment to its Islamic identity, rather than a dramatic departure from established practice. The international reaction, including celebrity boycotts of Brunei-owned properties and diplomatic pressure from Western governments, provided an unexpected lesson in the realities of 21st century geopolitics. Brunei discovered that sovereign decision-making, however legally justified, could have economic consequences that extended far beyond national borders. The Sultanate's response was characteristically measured, maintaining its position while engaging in quiet diplomacy to minimize economic fallout. The experience reinforced the importance of carefully balancing cultural authenticity with international expectations. Meanwhile, the diversification efforts that formed the heart of Wawasan Brunei 2035 were beginning to show tangible results. The establishment of major petrochemical facilities, including the massive Hengi Industries refinery complex, demonstrated that Brunei could successfully attract foreign investment in high-value manufacturing. These projects not only added value to Brunei's petroleum exports, but created employment opportunities for skilled Bruneians and established the Sultanate as a regional hub for downstream energy industries. The Islamic finance sector emerged as another promising avenue for diversification, building on Brunei's strong Islamic credentials and its relationship with major Muslim economies. The Sultanate positioned itself as a center for Sharia-compliant banking and investment services. The success was gradual but steady, with Islamic financial institutions expanding their operations and attracting deposits from across the Muslim world. By the 2010s, Islamic finance had become a genuine alternative to traditional petroleum revenues, even if still relatively modest in scale. Tourism development proved more challenging, requiring a delicate balance between economic opportunity and cultural preservation. Brunei's pristine rainforests, unique wildlife, and rich cultural heritage certainly attracted visitors, but the Sultanate was determined to avoid the environmental and social disruption that mass tourism had brought to other Southeast Asian destinations. The solution was selective development focused on ecotourism and cultural education, attracting smaller numbers of visitors who were genuinely interested in learning about Brunei, rather than simply consuming its resources. Technology and innovation received increasing emphasis as the 21st century progressed, recognizing that small nations could compete globally in knowledge-based industries. Brunei invested heavily in telecommunications, infrastructure, and digital literacy programs. The University of Brunei Darussalam expanded its research capabilities, while government initiatives encouraged entrepreneurship and innovation among young Bruneians. By the 2020s, Brunei had achieved some of the highest internet penetration rates in Southeast Asia, creating a foundation for future growth in digital industries. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 provided the most severe test of Brunei's resilience since independence. The Sultanate's response demonstrated both the advantages and limitations of its approach to governance. Rapid border closures and comprehensive health measures helped Brunei achieve one of the lowest infection rates globally, while the government's financial resources allowed it to support affected businesses and workers without accumulating dangerous debt levels. Yet the pandemic also exposed the vulnerabilities that came with Brunei's small size and specialized economy. International tourism disappeared overnight, while global supply chain disruptions affected everything from food imports to manufacturing inputs. The experience reinforced the importance of diversification while highlighting how difficult it was for any small nation to achieve complete economic independence in an interconnected world. Perhaps more significantly, the pandemic accelerated global conversations about sustainability and climate change that posed fundamental questions about the future of petroleum-dependent economies. International pressure for reduced carbon emissions, combined with growing investment in renewable energy technologies, suggested that the global transition away from fossil fuels might happen faster than Brunei's planners had anticipated. The Sultanate found itself needing to balance continued petroleum revenues with preparation for a world that increasingly viewed fossil fuels as problematic rather than essential. The response was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than resisting global trends, Brunei began exploring opportunities in the emerging green economy. Solar energy projects took advantage of the Sultanate's tropical location, while research into sustainable technologies attracted international partnerships. The approach wasn't about abandoning petroleum overnight, but rather about ensuring that Brunei would be well positioned when global energy markets inevitably shifted toward renewable sources. Regional dynamics also became increasingly complex during this period. China's growing influence in Southeast Asia created both opportunities and challenges for Brunei's foreign policy. Chinese investment in major infrastructure projects brought welcome capital for diversification efforts, but it also raised questions about maintaining the strategic autonomy that had served Brunei well since independence. The Sultanate's approach was to engage constructively with China while strengthening relationships with other major powers, ensuring that Brunei wouldn't become overly dependent on any single partner. The South China Sea disputes that periodically flared up during this period placed Brunei in a particularly delicate position. As one of several ASEAN nations with overlapping territorial claims, Brunei had to balance its legitimate interests with its preference for quiet diplomacy. The Sultanate's approach was consistent with its overall foreign policy philosophy, maintaining its legal position while working through multilateral institutions to prevent conflicts that could destabilize the entire region. By the 2020s, Brunei's journey into the 21st century had produced a track record of measured success mixed with ongoing challenges. The Sultanate had maintained political stability and social cohesion, while many other nations struggled with polarization and conflict. Economic diversification, while incomplete, had created new sources of growth and employment that reduced dependence on petroleum revenues. International respect for Brunei's approach to development remained high, even among those who disagreed with specific policies. Yet significant challenges remained as Brunei approached the final decade before its 2035 vision deadline. Unemployment, particularly among young people, persisted despite economic growth. The private sector remained relatively small, with many Bruneians still preferring government employment over entrepreneurial ventures. Most fundamentally, the pace of economic diversification, while impressive by regional standards, might not be fast enough to fully compensate for eventual petroleum depletion. The solutions being pursued reflected Brunei's characteristic approach of careful evolution rather than revolutionary change. Educational reforms emphasized skills relevant to the modern economy, while maintaining respect for traditional values. Foreign investment was welcomed in strategic sectors while preserving Brunei's cultural identity and national sovereignty. International partnerships were expanded while maintaining the diplomatic neutrality that had served the Sultanate well for decades. As Brunei looks toward the remainder of the 2020s and beyond, the lessons of the new millennium's first quarter seem clear. The Sultanate's combination of prudent resource management, gradual diversification, and cultural continuity has provided remarkable stability in an increasingly turbulent world. The challenge now is accelerating this progress sufficiently to achieve the ambitious goals of Wawasan Brunei 2035 while preserving the social harmony and national character that makes Brunei unique. The oil blessing that transformed Brunei from a small protectorate into a prosperous sovereign state has been well managed, but its ultimate success will be measured by how effectively it enables the transition to a post-petroleum future. With less than a decade remaining before the 2035 deadline, Brunei's leaders and citizens face the task of completing one of the most remarkable economic transformations in modern history, moving from resource dependence to knowledge-based prosperity while maintaining the cultural authenticity and social cohesion that have long been the Sultanate's greatest strengths. The story of modern Brunei demonstrates that small nations can indeed chart successful courses in an increasingly complex world, but only through careful planning, prudent resource management, and the wisdom to adapt without losing essential character. As the Sultanate continues its journey into the 21st century, it carries with it both the confidence that comes from past success and the humility to recognize that the greatest challenges may still lie ahead. The ultimate test of Brunei's development model will be whether the foundations laid during the oil era can support sustained prosperity in whatever world emerges beyond petroleum.